This is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm DonnFelker.
And I'm KaushikGopal.
Welcome to the show.
Before we begin today's show, a moment to thank our sponsor, Hired.com. Sometimes you go all the way through an interview process just to find out right at the very end that either the salary offer isn't good or the company culture doesn't match. That kind of sucks. But not if you go with Hired.com. They have a much more structured and organized process. Now, throughout the whole process, your dedicated talent advocate will completely have your back. They'll give you unbiased career coaching to help you put your best foot forward with potential employers. It's awesome. Now, Hired offers access to almost 4,000 innovative employers, including like big brand names, all the big ones you can think of, Facebook, and even the small engineering startups. So the size and the type of company you want to connect with is completely up to you. Okay, so where all can you use Hired? Well, currently they're in 17 major cities in North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. So any one of these places, just reach out to them. Even if you're open to relocation, let them know and they can probably hook you up. So, okay, let's get down to it. How much does using Hired.com cost? I mean, a dedicated talent advocate, it's got to cost a lot. Wait for it. Actually, they pay you. Usually, Hired.com's customers get a $1,000 hiring bonus. But as a listener of Fragmented, by signing up with the show's special link, that's Hired.com/fragmented, you get double the bonus. So that's $2,000. So if you're looking for a job, use Hired.com and do use our special link. They'll know you came from us and that'll help support the show. Thank you so much for sponsoring today's show, Hired. All right. So Don, before we begin today's show, I have a quick piece of follow-up that I want to do from episode 52, which I released. It was a fragment where I talked about the parameterized testing technique.
Which is awesome.
Oh, thank you. So there are two pieces of follow-up from that. One is I mentioned Jose Alcerecca, who's a good friend of the show, and I know he listens to the show. Mm-hmm. I also want to give a shout out to Stephan Linzer, who I also had the pleasure of meeting at I.O. this time. And he also, in fact, the piece of code that I was talking about was written by him. So Jose was kind enough to point that out on Twitter. So shout out to Stephan as well. The other thing is a listener, Tim Kist, sent this thing. Basically, Square has the equivalent of parameterized, but without all the heavy boilerplate code and all the clunky object array stuff, and it's called Burst. We'll add a link to the blog post where they introduce this, and it's essentially the same parameterized technique, but with nicer APIs in typical Square fashion. So that is our Square library for the episode.
I think at least like 50% of my import statements are like Square.
Yeah, that is probably true for most projects these days.
Like 10% Jake Wharton. 10%.
Yeah, what would we do without those good people?
Okay, well, today we're going to talk about something a little bit different today. There's no guest on the show, but we have had some questions pop up around Git, branching methodologies, release strategies, versioning, and folks have asked us this online in various different formats, and so we just kind of figured it would be a good time to chat about what we felt and what we do for our different projects. And so we're going to have some variations. Kaushik and I share a lot of the same principles. I deviate a little bit, and there are various reasons for that, which we'll get into in a second. I'll hop right in by saying that I kind of started learning Git probably back in 2008, I think was my earliest memory of touching it.
Oh, that's pretty early.
Yeah, it's coming from Subversion. I don't even remember. It was really 0. something is what it was.
SVN. Anyway. Wow, good days.
Yeah. What was it before that? Was it
CVS?
CVS?
No. Was it CVS?
CVS or VCS? Remember that?
Yeah. Version control system. That's like the generic term though, right?
Yeah, but no. Oh no, SourceSafe was before that.
SourceSafe. Wow.
Did you ever use SourceSafe?
I don't know if I use something with the C. I remember that. And then we switched. CVS. Okay. And then we
moved
I
think of the drugstore though when I say that. That SourceSafe was like that original one from Microsoft.
Oh, interesting.
Like it would just like randomly corrupt and you're like, oh, sorry, lost all of your repository. Bye.
Oh man. Yeah, those were the dark days. I remember when we moved to SVN, it was a big thing. And there was this client called TortoiseSVN?
Yes, TortoiseSVN, yep.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. But then we were all saved and Git came in, so...
Definitely. So anyway, back in 2008, I started using Git. Back then, there was no real formalized anything, and just understanding what Git was and how to use it was like this magical black wizardry.
I was going to say the same thing. Like understanding Git in itself was an effort. So
yeah, it was. And like when I finally understood it was like, I just felt like this, the clouds opened up. But anyway, it wasn't until around 2000, I think late 2009 and early 2010 is when I found Git Flow. And that was based upon a blog post by a gentleman by the name of Vincent Dreesen, I think is how you say it. So yeah, it looks like it was 2010, January of 2010 when I found it. And he goes into like a really in-depth example of like using master branch with a develop branch. You have feature branches, release branches, hot fixes, and then you have like, the time axis and like kind of where all this merging and everything comes into place and versioning and everything. And so I kind of went down that road. And then over the next few years, we kind of evolved and kind of kept a lot of those same principles, but didn't use any of the additional built-in shell scripts and so forth. And now I'm kind of to the point where I loosely follow kind of a Git flow-like methodology. But my main purpose for that is I find that when I go to a lot of clients, they kind of follow that model already. And if they don't, I can then give them a basis of saying, here's what has worked before in the past for a bunch of other clients. We loosely follow this type of pattern, which we can talk about a little bit more. And that kind of gives them a good place to jump off from. And then at that point, they can kind of adjust it as necessary. And I think it's kind of similar to what you have done. And you guys have kind of taken a little bit of an alternative approach to that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's pretty much the same thing. And like you rightly pointed out, this is not like anything earth-shattering or groundbreaking. This is like, most big sort of systems. For example, my lead was telling me the other day, Postgres, which releases Postgres, the database, they follow the exact same versioning system. And so this is sort of like a proven solution. The Linux kernel is basically developed in a very similar fashion. And I mean, Linus Torvalds essentially came up with Git to enable this kind of a workflow. So going back to your point, it seems like the most optimum workflow. Now, obviously, there are like differences where you can tweak it, like you rightly said, here and there, but it boils down to a very similar sort of approach.
Let's hop in to talk a little bit about how you do it. And then I'm going to kind of jump in there in between and kind of say, hey, now, when you do it this way, I kind of maybe will diverge a little bit, and then folks can kind of see what the differences are. And then we can kind of at the end, we'll just say, hey, here's the similarities, and here's kind of where we differ, so folks can see the two different models. They're very similar with just a small little, little difference.
That sounds like a plan. Let's do it.
All right.
We'll start off with like certain tenets, right? Like certain things are supposed to be true in this workflow, and like we'll start from there. And then as we talk about those points, the whole workflow will start to make sense. And then I think the advantage with that approach is also that people would then be able to figure out what needs to be done versus us specifying precise commands, right? Because I don't think that would be an approach that works out here. So the first thing is the way at least we, like when I say we, I mean, this is a specific team at Instacart. So we have only a single sort of trunk, which is master. Right. And I think here is basically a big difference between what many other people follow. They have like a develop branch, they have like a dev branch or something along those lines. We just have the master branch, and that's the equivalent of our sort of canary or bleeding edge or nightly build. All our changes, our latest changes, everything goes into the master branch.
Okay.
I'll talk about some of the other kinds of branches, and then like we'll try to again touch base and see how like what your thoughts on and how like we sort of handle these things.
Yeah, my main difference, I mean, right off the bat here is that you have your master branch as that kind of the main canary bleeding edge. Now, does that mean that all of the most recent changes are there?
Yep. So if you want to pull the latest changes that every single developer has deemed relatively stable and wants to sort of like others to sort of pull down, that's in the master branch.
Okay, that's going to be probably the main difference almost of this entire conversation is that my master branch is rarely ever touched. It's only touched when I'm ready to release something, and that's either going to be something that's pushed to, like say, Google Play as a regular, feature release, or maybe a hot fix. But it's only stuff that's going to be released, and that's the only time I'll push to master. So your master branch is bleeding edge. That's where my develop branch is. My develop branch is the bleeding edge, and then everything kind of branches off of there. So that's our main difference, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I already have an idea of like the approach that you mentioned. So when we talk about release branches and how like I handle that, we can have an interesting conversation there, because I think that's where like it all sort of like blends in.
Totally.
So apart from a primary master branch, there are feature branches. Now, feature branches are essentially what individual like developers work on. So if I have like a feature, then whenever I begin anything, I start with a new branch saying feature 1. And a typical sort of discipline that we have found that works is we prefix each branch with our first names. Now, usually at Instacart, they refer to me as KG because that's just simpler, like considering my full name. So all of my branches have the prefix KG and a /. It would be KG / feature _1, KG / feature _2. Those are essentially feature branches where if I'm building on some feature, all of those things go in there. Now, a couple of things with this feature branch. It's very, very important that you keep rebasing off master on this. So if I have this feature that I'm working on for maybe like a couple of days, 3 or 4 days, it's important that at every juncture that is possible, I keep rebasing off of my master.
I'm just gonna be devil's advocate here. Why shouldn't I, as a developer, just like wait till I'm done and then rebase? What's the problem with that?
That's a great question. And that's actually a very, very bad practice. And the reason you don't want to keep very long-lived feature branches, or at least you want to make sure that you're rebasing fast enough, is because when you're working in a team and you have other people making changes, the longer you have your feature branch running, the possibilities that you would run into merge conflicts, which is basically one of the scariest things with Git, is way higher. So if you have a feature branch that you've been working on an old version of master for about 4 or 5 days, and then and you have like 3 or 4 developers like merging left and right, especially if you have people who refactor stuff, like that's going to like cause a lot of problems 5 days later where you try to merge your feature back onto a master, because essentially the code would have drifted and you'd spend like hours just like trying to resolve that merge conflict. So it goes back to the same thing. Like when you have smaller patch sets, when you have smaller changes, it's just easier to deal with that merge conflict, right? So that's essentially why you want to keep rebasing off master as fast as possible. I imagine you pretty much do the same thing, right?
Totally do the same thing. It's I am habitual about, rebasing on top of, develop for me because of that exact issue. Like I don't mind merge conflicts. I've gotten used to them and resolving them. But what I don't like is getting into that monstrous merge that takes you 6 hours to go through because there's this, conflict after conflict. It's nice when I kind of merge it down. It's like, oh, you have 3 merge conflicts. And you're like, okay, I can fix these real fast because I'm familiar with the code. I remember I just changed this, a couple of hours ago. Okay, that needs to move here. This needs to move over there. Cool, I'm done. Keep moving on. But when you have that huge monster merge conflict or feels like hundreds of them, but it's probably not. But when it feels like that, it can kill your productivity. It can kill your enjoyable process of just working in whatever you're working in. So definitely, if you can do it more often, I would highly recommend it.
A quick tangent. What do you use for handling your merge conflicts? Because I know even over time, I've become like comfortable. Like I'm not as scared of merge conflicts as it used to happen before. But I'm curious, like what is your tooling process with it?
That's a good question. So I think it's hop back to the command line is my home for Git. I am not I'm not a GUI Git person. Only time I use a GUI tool is anytime. Well, if I'm in Android Studio and I want to take a look at a diff or anything like that, or I'm just committing some changes, I'll maybe use that. But it's probably only 20% of the time that I maybe less than that, 10%. So the rest of the time is inside of the command line. And so that means if I am rebasing and I get that nice little message saying, hey, there is a merge conflict or whatever the exact term is inside of the command line, what I do is I have a diff tool already set up. And there's a ton of them out there that you can use. And I think there's ones that have 2-way merge and 3-way merge. And it's really think it's up to the developer to what they prefer. I have found over the years what works best for me is kind of like the two-way merge, what's on the left and what's on the right, and then you can kind of like mix and match from there. And so what I end up using is Diff Merge, and that's from SourceGear actually. You can download it and use it for free and try it out, and they'll keep bugging you to try to buy a license to please support it. I bought a license just because it's just one of those tools. It's like $19, I think is what it was, that like, okay, super easy. All I have to do is I get a merge conflict, get merge tool, boom, it pops up my merge conflict in a window. I can resolve it in a GUI tool, close it out, and I'm back in the command line. Do you use anything?
Like you, I used to be a big command line user just because I have been using Git for some time. And so I was very comfortable with the command line. And so I always stuck to it. And I wasn't really too comfortable with most of the fancy GUI tools that came out. But I did change that recently when, of course, when we switched to IntelliJ and I started using Android Studio. Android Studio, like IntelliJ has an amazing diff tool. Like their diff tool kills. And there's also like this option, and I think in a previous episode we mentioned, where you can use like a command line launcher. You can set it up. So what you can do is you can configure Git to sort of use the same tool from IntelliJ for your diffing. So that's basically what I use now, because I feel very comfortable with that tool now. And it's, as you rightly said, there's like a two-way merge. You can say, hey, you know what, just show me the changes from the local and what the current file is, and then just show me the changes with the current file and what we see from the server. And so usually I do that when there's like a bigger merge conflict. I adopt that approach, and it immediately tells me like, oh, those are the set of changes that are coming in. So when I bring all those changes into the file, I know like where to pull and where to ignore stuff. So I found that the more and more I've used that tool now that's become my default. So by default, when I diff or like I have a merge conflict that needs resolution, I just resort to that tool. That's worked out really well for me.
That's interesting. I'm gonna have to give the merge tool inside of IntelliJ and Android Studio a shot. I've just been using Diff Merge. I can't even tell you how long it might have been since 2010, very early on. So it's I think it's useful, but having it built into the IDE is so much easier at the same time, because then you don't have to switch tools.
Right.
So you prefix your features with your initials. So KG hyphen whatever your feature name is, that's correct, right? So I have done this as well. This is something that as soon as I branch into 2 or more developers on a team, I prefer this approach of my name hyphen or my initials hyphen feature. And actually Realm does this too. So if you actually go to github.com/realm Java, whatever that is, you can just look at their branches right there. You'll actually see the developers' names on the Realm team, like CM, which Christian was on the show here. CM is his branches. You can see Emmanuel's branches. EZ is his initials there. And so you'll see all these different branches on there. So it's actually really cool. There's tons of them in there. A lot of other folks follow the same process. My only deviation from this is when I'm working on a project by myself, I still follow these same principles, except I don't prefix it with my initials because I'm the only person. And at that point, I'll just call it like feature hyphen, add button to menu or whatever.
And this makes a lot of sense. Again, a lot of the things we say, people might feel, oh, you know what, I'm a single developer. I don't necessarily have to use this. But the minute you join a team of 2, like you'll start to see these benefits. And this is like a proven system, right? Like people released versioned software using this system. So it's just in your benefit to learn this system. Once you're comfortable with Git, it isn't too difficult to follow this process because it's very methodical.
We did the same branching model at MyFitnessPal the entire time I was there. When I was at Point, we did the same thing. And now with various clients that I'm working with now, there's also very similar approach to this. So it is definitely a proven model. And to further your point of, even if you're doing this by yourself, you may feel like it's quite heavyweight. Like, well, I don't need to do that. I can just run everything right off develop. I understand that totally. But just getting yourself into that mental mindset of like, all right, this is the way that I always do it. It just becomes something like muscle memory to you. Like when you create a new feature branch, it just goes here. And what you'll notice eventually is you'll be working on that feature branch, making commits to it, and all of a sudden something comes up. You'll get a bug report or a crash from Crashlytics that you realize is affecting every user, and you're just like, oh, poop. And at that point in time, if you're running everything off of like your bleeding edge environment and you have all these changes, like you're kind of in a weird situation if you haven't created release branches, which we'll talk about in a second, and you're just running off that environment. if you have these feature branches or whatever, you can kind of say, hey, I'm going to stash these changes or commit it as a work in progress and then hop back over to my master or my release branches and then fix those things and move on. It just gets you in a good mindset. It's just a really good habit to build right out of the gate. And when you do join that team, it just makes it even easier because it's a seamless transition for you.
That makes perfect sense.
Let's talk about release branches. So how do you go about doing your releases with this type of Git environment that we're talking about today?
Yeah, so release branches, are very different from feature branches. Release branches, the way at least we approach it is anytime you have a set of changes that are ready to be released to a user, even if it's like a beta version, anytime it's going to hit someone who's not a developer, what we do is we create a release branch, right? And again, the nomenclature that we follow here is we have the prefix release. So for feature branches, we have our initials. With release branches, we just have like release /.
Yep.
And then we have the major.minor version. Now, I think we should take a quick aside and talk about semantic versioning here, which I think there's like benefits. So semantic versioning is a very cool sounding name to something that's very basic that probably everyone uses, right? So when you version your application, you have a major.minor.patch. Do you follow something similar like this for your versioning as well?
I do. I do follow the major.minor.patch, and sometimes there's a variation on this in that the patch is sometimes just used as the build number. So it depends on the company that I'm working with. They may replace patch with just build number.
Gotcha. So
we'll get into what those are right now.
Right. So, I mean, essentially the major version is like when you have breaking API changes, right? And most libraries that you notice, for example, retrofit 1, retrofit 2, RxJava 1, RxJava 2, the minute you have a major version bump, that basically means your API has broken, which means the developer has to go back and change code in order to sort of like support this new version. So that's basically any breaking API changes require a major version bump. Minor versions are when you have features, basically, right? So if you have like a smallish feature, like a new feature that you want to say, hey, user, this is a new feature that we added. So it isn't necessarily any API breaking change, but it's just like a new feature that you add. You bump the minor version up. So typically when you have new features, users would start to see these bump up.
We have major, right? And that's for incompatible API changes. But let's say we're talking about like consumer app like Instacart or another one like MyFitnessPal. The only person who really develops on these platforms is you and I, the developers on those teams. At what point do we determine a major? In my experience, it's kind of been like, all right, well, we're maybe doing a big redesign, and there's a tremendous amount of change in the application, and visually it may even look completely different. At that point, we would usually bump a major version. What do you guys do in that situation?
We've talked about this before, right? Because in the context of like mobile applications, like what does breaking API mean? Because everything is just like binary in the end, right?
Yeah.
The way we have sort of settled with this is whenever you have, for example, and this is like even common with iOS, right? Or even like Android, when you have a min SDK change, like for example, we're saying, hey, from now on, we're only going to support min SDK 17 or min SDK 19, where something fundamentally changes with the application. For example, even if we say, hey, from now on, we're only going to support Google Play services and not like anything else, or like vice versa, those in the context of an application causes a major version bump. So like in iOS, I remember recently we had a version bump because our folks there, like they get to be more aggressive about their min version, and I think iOS 7 was what they was canceled support for, so they bumped to iOS 8, and that allowed them to basically start using Swift in their code, right? So that made a major version bump because we're basically fundamentally changing something where it's sort of breaking. Like it's not necessarily breaking, at least with min SDK. It just means that you won't get updated versions of the application. But it still is something that causes, like, it's a very fundamental architecture change that where the customer has some sort of like an effect. So that's how we have settled for it.
What if you guys do have that situation where you're on version 2.1, major.minor, and your designers come in with a brand new spanking design? They don't ever do that, right?
No, never.
No, just all the designers out there, we love you. We're just giving you a hard time. If they do come in with that brand new design and it is cool, and if you're moving over everything to material, do you guys just go, all right, well, this is cool. We like it. We're going to implement it. Now that's version 2.2?
That's where we've been a little wishy-washy. Like we have done that once, but like, when we bumped everything to like the material design change that came in, I don't remember. I think it was with AppCompat, right? We did bump the major version up there.
Okay.
So we haven't settled on necessarily a formula, but you're pretty much like, I think you sort of like understand where I'm coming from. Like whenever you have like a drastic change and we just have a major version bump. Have you followed a similar thing? Like if you have like a huge UI rewrite, do you just like bump the major version up?
Again, I'm coming from a consulting side of the fence, and usually a lot of the times, and I don't know if you've experienced this before, but a lot of the times version numbers will almost come from a top-down perspective from product might say, hey, this is this is the 3.0 version of the app, and you're like, well, we're still supporting API 16, like what are you talking about? And they're like, no, this is 3.0, this is a marketing push. So I've seen it in that regard, but then I've also seen it where you're going to change some a major piece of the application, like maybe you're removing your content provider that you were sharing with the rest of the world, and that's a good reason to bump your major. Because it is breaking an API at that point, or if you are changing a min SDK level. So what I've noticed every time there's a major bump, though, it's not just one small thing like, hey, we're not going to support API levels 16 anymore. We're going to go to min SDK 19. Usually it's that and a whole bunch of other major things that are getting rolled into that as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess we're pretty much on the same page. And if listeners are interested, there's actually this page called semver.org. We'll add a link to that in the show notes, where they actually talk about semantic versioning. This is something that a group of software engineers have actually thought about and come up with a reasonable sort of standard to approach this thing. So that was major and minor. Let's talk about patch quickly. So patch, any fixes that like bug fixes, or like if you want to add like an incremental thing, that's essentially how we just keep increasing patches for that, right? So that's so if we have like a beta version out and then like users come back and report like maybe there's like some small issue, then we keep bumping up the patch number. And I mean, that's how we go about that specific use case. Is that also how you use the patch number?
I use the patch number actually. Well, yes, I do, because every single change is something that's getting patched, added, or whatever. If it's a major feature, of course, then I'll bump the minor on that. But that's a manual process. I usually like to leave the last number, and this is kind of where I kind of depends on the situation will change. Sometimes I'll have that patch in there because a company wants to stick to strict semver type of standards, and then at that point what I'll actually do is actually attach another value on the end of that, so it'll be major, minor, patch, and then .build, and then that build will actually be the build number from continuous integration server like Circle or Jenkins or anything like that. Now, on the flip side of that, there may be companies that are like, we really don't care about patch that much, but we do want this to increment with each of our builds, and we will replace, it'll be major.minor.build number, which was kind of where they're just saying, hey, that's in place of the patch,
right.
And it just increments each time. The nice thing about that is you can calculate that inside of your build.gradle file, which I do, and then I will just build that whole version name inside of the Gradle file, and it'll pull the system environment variables from the build server, so it actually increments each time I perform the build.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
What do you guys do anything for the build number at all?
Yeah, we just keep bumping it up. It just runs from 1 to like whatever that build is. So like 99, 100, it just is monotonically increasing.
Gotcha. Okay.
One interesting thing there, again, a side point I think that we should mention is, as much as you can, all of this should be automated, right? And I think we talked about this before. What we do here is like I actually wrote a Ruby script that sort of just bumps this version. So all I do is on command line, I say, hey, release major, release space minor, release space patch, and it automatically figures out what this build number should be. So I don't have to manually go and change it in any place. I know it's pretty common at this point to also do it with Groovy right in Gradle.
That's what you use, right? I know you love that language.
I definitely do not like Groovy, and I have been shamed once or twice. They're like, "Hey, isn't the whole point with Gradle that it uses a programming language? It uses Groovy." I'm like, "Yeah, it is, but I like Ruby better, so I'm just gonna keep my script in Ruby." Now, with the announcement of Kotlin being used in Gradle, I might change that. Like now that is something that I might be interested in. But if you're asking me to move something that's written in Ruby to Groovy,
I don't know about that.
I don't know about that. Like, I think developer sanity is a real thing. So
there are folks out there that listen to the show that love Groovy, and if you're one of them, then cool, keep on keeping on. I'm with you there. Personally, I have to stick with Kaushik here. I'm more of a fan of Ruby myself, and if I can't have Ruby, then maybe some Python or something.
Yeah. Having it automated might not seem like a big thing, but it is an absolute essential productivity boost. Like almost every team that I've worked on in every company, because I know how this has worked in the past, I just quickly write that script, and week 2, everyone is like thanking me, saying, hey, this is like the best thing ever. Because the other advantage is if, again, like at Instacart, we sort of encourage other developers and other teams who work on different platforms to also start to get into mobile development. And just having this one-line thing makes it simple. We don't have to explain to them how Gradle works, how our versioning system works. It's all just a single command line, right? So I think there's a huge benefit there.
So you're going to run the script, and it's going to release your major, your minor dot patch. What about these release branches? How are you creating these?
Anytime I have something that's releasable to the user, I create a release branch, right?
Okay.
Now the release branch is sort of sacred, and this is where I think our difference lies in like the workflow. You mentioned that in master you basically have your stable sort of like points, right? So it's like a bolt there where you don't where you have like a stable sort of notion. So at any point of time, if someone says, hey, I need version 4.27 of the app, you would typically go to your master branch and then look for that release, right?
Yes and no. Yes, but we'll get in deeper in a minute.
Okay, yeah. So basically what we do is we have a release /4.27. Importantly, we don't have the build number there, right? So it's just the major and the minor. And what we do is those branches basically live on. So these are very different from feature branches. You do not rebase on master with this. Don't rebase on master with this, because then it might rewrite history and you'll get into like a whole bunch of other problems, which we won't necessarily go into detail. This is basically sacred, right? So this is like a point in time. And what we do here is, and this is where like the discipline varies across like different teams, we have release 4.27. The minute we know that a new feature is going to be developed and like we're beta testing it, we'll immediately add another release branch called release /4.28. So both of these releases might be running in parallel, right? And at any point of time, at least in our experience, the way it's worked is we have 3 live release branches. So we have the earliest version. So like maybe let's put some examples in here so it's a little easy to visualize. So say release 4.27 is our stable version, right? And so we have 4.27. We would also have a 4.28 and a 4.29, right? 4.28 and 4.29 are probably not released to everyone because we do staged rollouts. So that's probably released to maybe like 5% of our users or 10% of our users. But
what just for folks that aren't unaware of this, but I think we should explain what staged releases are for folks that aren't really up to par with that, or maybe aren't the ones actually pressing the buttons on Google Play.
Oh yeah, for sure. So staged releases is like this godsend thing that you have, especially if you're a company that releases pretty fast and you don't necessarily have like a whole QA team sitting here waiting for you to give them a build and sort of like testing. So staged rollouts essentially allows you to say, hey, take my application, but don't release it to everyone. Because if there's like a bug that's like obvious enough in some flow that I haven't necessarily tested myself, I don't want everyone to start crashing on it. So what I'm trying to do is I'm sort of minimizing the risk by saying, just release it to like maybe 5% of my users. Let 5% of my users use this. And if you're using Crashlytics or Rollbar or any of the other tools that we've mentioned in the past, like the person who releases that specific number keeps a keen look on one of these tools. Or if you have it automated, those notifications come to you and you start to see, hey, in this version, like I've noticed that there's like a bump of this specific crash. The advantage with that is then you can go back and say, oh, I made a mistake with that thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly patch that and then release it back to those 5% or 10% and then collect data again. And you can slowly start loosening that bolt and say, okay, increase it to 20%, increase it to 50%, increase it to 80%. And eventually you'll get to 100%, right? If you don't have like extensive testing, this is again like another strategy, though you should have extensive testing. That's like automated testing. You should always like shoot for that. That's the safest thing. But if you wanted to maybe test real world cases, that's another example, right? You have like this crazy device that's being used with some other weird sort of setting. Staged rollouts really help with those kind of settings.
Now, when you go, so let's say you're working on that 4.29 release, right? You run your script and you publish that out and you decide to release it to 5% of your current user base. You have 1 million users, so whatever that calculation is. And those 5% get it, right? You realize you all of a sudden you get a bunch of crashes. And you just say, oh no, we got to fix this line of code right here. You fix that. At that point, so if you have a release / 4.29, do you create another branch off of that one called release 4.30 and then add the fix to that?
If it's a patch fix, we don't, right? So that's why it's important that if it's release 4.29 and you're adding a patch, right? So that patch basically lives on in that branch. So it would be 4.27.2 or .4 or .11 or .12. So we don't create a new branch, a new release branch, especially if a feature hasn't changed, right? If it's all just patch fixes, like you notice a crash, immediately you drop into that branch and then you just patch that and you keep it living within the same release, branch.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I know some people also create a new release branch and then like drop the old release branch, but I know many people do the same thing.
Basically sticks to semantic versioning. You're using the patch as, the release. This is the 4.29 release, and oops, we made a mistake. We need to patch it. And that's kind of what the patch part of semantic versioning is there for, so you can fix it. Now, you did say something about having 3 different versions out there, though. So how does that work?
Yeah, this is where it gets really tricky and super interesting, right? So you said, what if you had 4.29? So I patch 4.29, all is good in the world because that's the latest release.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what if I noticed in 4.27, which is typically supposed to be my stable version, right? I noticed, hey, there's actually this bug fix that doesn't hit too many users, but it's something that we've noticed and we know how to fix. We got to fix this. So you would fix it at 4.27, right? So I would add a patch, assuming our stable version is 4.27.10, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm adding a patch, and so then it goes to 4.27.11. This is fine, but I can't just like merge this onto master because I already have certain parallel branches, right? I have 4.28 and 4.29 going out to 5 or 10% of my users. Like, what do? Like, they don't get the fix. It doesn't work like that, right? So the key element here is if you create a patch on a previous version, so it's 4.27, you have to first merge onto the next immediate version. So if I add the fix to 4.27, I have to merge that fix onto 4.28. Then I have to go to that 4.28 branch and then merge that fix onto 4.29. Then I have to go onto the 4.29 branch and merge that fix back onto master or develop in your case, right? So because master or develop is typically the latest version. So that's like 4.50 or 4.999, right? Because that's you can think of that as being like at any point of time, that is always the latest version. So you eventually have to merge that back into master, which is why and it's important to maintain this flow because that is how you ensure that master always has like the fixes that you add into any release branch. Does that make sense? Do you follow a similar sort of thing?
Yeah, and this is I think it's normally called like patching up is kind of a common term. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Like the question I have for you is how do you go about doing this? I know how I do it, and if I'm on 4.27, I have to patch that. I commit that. Let's just use one commit as a easy example here. If I have to commit that, and usually it's one commit because I don't want a bunch of commits on there because then for whatever reason I'm gonna have to bump it again, and it's easier to keep track of. So let me roll back here. Let's say it takes me 4 commits to actually fix this issue. I'll actually take those 4 commits and I'll squash them into one commit on 4.27. I'll say, all right, here is this fixes the problem. We are now at 4.27.2 or whatever that is. And now I need to bring that up to 4.28. What I would normally do is go, check out 4.28, and then I will cherry pick it over. How do you normally go about doing that?
Now, again, I think both would work, but I literally merge 27 back onto 28.
Because the commits are already there, so I guess,
Yeah, because 27, like if you're doing this correct, essentially all the commits that were on 27. And this is where like the semantic versioning, there's like this concept of like each version being monotonically increasing.
Yep.
So 4.29 should always have all the changes that 4.28 has and all the changes that 4.27 has, right? And that's why, like, the version number increase makes sure that, like, you always have all the features and all the fixes from a previous version.
Yeah, so you could totally merge that and you do the same exact thing, yeah.
Right. So I think, like, the difference is if you cherry pick it, possibly your history is a little cleaner. I am not entirely sure of that. I don't recall. But with merge, what happens is it'll show that the branch has been merged. So it shows a more truer representation of the history. But cherry picking, I think, makes it look nicer. But either approach would definitely work if you're doing things correctly, right?
Yeah, and it does matter if you have merge commits in there. If you don't have merge commits, and if you're just trying to keep that clean tree structure.
Right.
So it depends on your team of how you're doing. I've been on teams where no merge commits were allowed and you had to rebase everything. So we basically had just a straight line of commits, which was nice, but it did require a little bit more process. But as long as you're getting everything patched up accordingly, I think you're going to be good.
That's very true. And, like, we used to do that before, but then we realized the thing is, while that does allow a very clean Git history, we often noticed more often than not, we don't go back to the Git history until there was a problem, right? So it seemed like a lot of overhead for something that we weren't frequenting. And at that point anyway, if you're going to go back to the Git history to see or trace something, then you probably have to be, like, conversant enough where those don't necessarily matter as much, right? So that's why we shifted. But again, like, it makes total sense to adopt either approach depending on what your team feels works for them.
Exactly. And the reason why one of my clients did that was because we kept running into, we had developers all around the world in different teams that were committing to the same code base. And we kept running into weird issues where a bug was introduced and we couldn't figure out where it was introduced. So we'd have to continually do a git bisect. And git bisect would kind of be a little troublesome on the merge conflicts. And so I'm on the merge commits themselves. And so after going to just like the straight history, it made it easier. Since then, I think that client has gone back to merge commits because they have, adjusted their team accordingly. But that's the main reason why we did it at the time.
I want to ask you a quick question. Do you possibly automate that? Like, do you have, like, a mechanism just, like, automating the patching up process, or do you basically just, like, do it manually?
I'm more of a manual person. Usually it's not that far back. Usually,
me too.
Because I don't run 3 versions. Usually I may run 2. And again, this, for folks that are listening, some of you have apps out there and you're just trying to get to your first 50 or 100 users. So some of these things may not even apply to you. And if it's, these are some of the techniques that Kaushik and I have used at companies who have millions of users and millions of folks who download our app. So 5%, that's a ton of people. 50,000 people that automatically get an update. You'll see issues real fast. Now, if you have 100 users and 5 people have the app, they may not use it for a day or 2. So it may not make sense to use the rollouts, but it's something great to learn and to know about as well.
It is nice to get in that flow because once it becomes second nature to you, it's pretty liberating, right? Like in terms of like the process.
It totally is. And especially when you start, and this is my experience since I'm remote, when you're on the same page as everyone else on your team, and if you have a kind of a remote culture, it's so much easier to understand how everything works inside of Git because you can just go in there and understand where everything's at. Is it a feature? Is it a release? Or so forth, anything of that nature.
Yeah, you don't have to ping them at 2 a.m. Their time on Slack and then say, hey, I'm getting a merge conflict, or like, I don't understand why you have this version here. Mm-hmm. They won't appreciate that.
So do you have any scripts that you automatically use to patch up?
I used to previously try to automate this, but then I realized the problem, and the reason I asked this question was because I noticed sometimes I haven't found an efficient way to automate merge conflicts. Like that always requires us to sort of like dive in. And so at that point, it was like, if you have a merge conflict, then the whole automation is like thrown out of the like sort of equation, right? And then it actually becomes more difficult then because I have to trace how far ahead like you've gone through with the automated process. So with these patching up process, I've just found it easier to do it manually. The automation process hasn't worked for me in my experience at least. So the release is automated, but the process of like merging up and making sure you're applying the right change, we don't automate that. You follow something very similar, I imagine, too, right? Like, I'm curious to know at what point do you add like a release sort of bolt in your master? Because my master is your developer.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And there, again, coming from the consulting background, it changes with each client. But for the most part, if we have, let's take a release, for example, I do the same thing. I will branch off of, say, let's go from develop for whatever. We have develop, and then that's where we decide, hey, at this current point in time, we're ready to go ahead and release to, let's say, what's going to be release 2.0 or whatever. And then I'm going to branch off of develop, and then I'm going to create a release branch called 2.0, and that was branched off of develop. And then we may be in there for up to a week or so saying, hey, these are only these quick fixes that maybe the product team or QA is saying, hey, you need to add these things or fix these few bugs we found. What this does is it allows the rest of the team that's not doing those release-oriented fixes to continue on down the develop path, making commits back to that branch. Then at that point in time, when we finally get the sign off from, the product team or whoever, they say, hey, it looks like this is good. This is golden. Let's go ahead and ship this. I will then go ahead and merge that down, that release branch, release 2.0, down into master, and I'll tag it as 2.0. And then so this leaves master with very few, you see the tags. If you were to list the tags, you could see it from there. So very few tags. This does follow very close to the Git flow style. The only thing that's different with the Git flow style of methodology is I don't use a lot of the same commands that they use, like no fast forward or anything of that nature. I kind of stick to a lot of the plain stuff. But this has worked for me, and one of the main reasons that I use it is because it's a common ground that I can use when I go into a new client who doesn't have any process in place, and they're looking to me saying, hey, we're kind of a mess right now. How do we kind of get this process under control? I can come in and say, here's what we're going to do. I can actually show them some documentation that's already been built by somebody else, other people have used, and say, look, you'll start here, and then we can kind of evolve. And if we want to remove the develop and kind of go to your method, we can do that. That's totally an option. But here is, ground level where we're going to start.
That makes sense. All right. So that is like a whole boatload of information. And it's nice to see that like a lot of the stuff that you mentioned, we seem to be following the same thing too. So it's pretty good. And I imagine many other folks are also using the same approach. If you have used a different approach or you're interested in mentioning certain other things, like shoot us a message and let us know. Many listeners have asked like if we could talk about this process. So it's not necessarily just Android development related, but it's also something that is critical to like your development process.
I totally agree. And if anybody completely disagrees with us, Kaushik, how do they get a hold of you?
You can vent all your grievances at KaushikGopal at Twitter. That's I'm usually quick with those responses.
And if folks want to get a hold of me, you can also complain to me. I'll be a good sounding board. It's at DonnFelker on Twitter, or you can go to my website, DonnFelker.com.
Perfect. And if you have any joint feedback that you want to send us directly, then FragmentedCast is our Twitter handle. And like we'll try to add helpful links to all the stuff that we've talked about today in our show notes. And that will be at fragmentedpodcast.com/episodes/our episode number.
Definitely.
All right. Thank you, folks, for listening. And we will catch you in the next episode. And before we sign off, once again, we want to thank Hired for sponsoring this episode of Fragmented. If you land up getting a job through Hired, they'll give you a $1,000 bonus. But if you use our special link, hired.com/fragmented, you double it up and you get $2,000. Thank you so much for sponsoring this show, Hired.